my name is Dr. Nick Weshinskey. I'm a faculty member in the Southern Illinois University School of Medicine's Department of Medical Education. I have a national board certification in counseling, and I've worked as an outpatient counselor, crisis counselor, a group counselor, and so on and so forth. My clients have ranged in age from 3 years old to 73 years old. They've been grandmas and college students and ex-convicts and parents and survivors of abuse, and you name it, I've probably worked with it. In graduate school, I did most of my research in the area of men's studies, which is still somewhat unfamiliar even in academic circles. Basically, I learned a lot about how society shapes men and how and why men develop the attitudes and behaviors that we do, and how we might be able to work with men in more productive ways. So I want to use that to then start to dig in. And I want to begin with a basic idea, maybe the most basic idea, something fundamental to everything we're going to talk about today. And that is, when you're helping someone, you are the instrument. So I want to say that again. When you're helping someone, you are the instrument. As listeners, you are the greatest in-the-moment tool to provide help. Physicians evaluate people, and then they use scalpels and stethoscopes and syringes and things like that. Those are their tools. Those are their instruments. Soldiers plan, and then they use rifles and tanks, and those are their instruments. But helpers, when they listen, they use themselves. They are the instrument to deliver the help. So what does all of that even mean? Well, I think to some extent, it means you can and should trust your gut. If something feels off, then probe, clarify, provide comfort, refer someone to deeper help. You are the instrument. So if something feels off, it might be because something actually is. And even if all you do is just notice that something is off and run to get more help, that's important. Second, I think it's important that we practice the skills that we're going to learn today. They aren't necessarily natural. In fact, when you first start using them, they can feel awkward or uncomfortable. It can feel a little bit like trying on clothes that either fit too loose or too tight. You got to find the sweet spot. Practice will help you find that sweet spot. So the next logical question is, well, how do I practice these things? I think the answer is you just jump in. These skills are transferable and nearly universal. They're good whether you're speaking with a producer's family member, your neighbor. In fact, you might even talk about these skills with your friends and family and tell them you might just start using them when talking to them. I think you'll find that good listening and good helping skills will enrich your everyday relationships, not just your professional ones. Third, and this is a biggie, many of the producers and producers' family members that you work with might feel a lot of pride, which makes asking for or receiving help especially difficult. It might feel like a weakness or a threat. The pride factor might even influence the way you use the helping skills that we'll learn today. But I'm going to argue for just a moment that there's a little bit more than just pride at work. Though the number of women farming is increasing, according to the 2017 Ag Census by the USDA, which this is the most recent census available, as many as 84% of Illinois' primary producers, which are people who made the most decisions for a farm or who worked off the farm the least, 84% of Illinois' primary producers were men. Their average age is about 60. They're typically white. And this is painting in broad brushstrokes, but these are often very traditional men with very traditional ideas about what it means to be a man. And typically that means being tough, staying in control, never crying, working through physical pain, never backing down from a fight. And those aren't disparaging remarks. In fact, some of those are really admirable qualities. People's livelihoods and farms have persisted because of some of those qualities. So they're not disparaging remarks, they're just observations. And at times, those qualities can be maladaptive. I don't know about you, but I see glimpses of my dad in those remarks. I see my uncles. More often than not, I see myself. And psychologists have measured the ways that these traits manifest themselves in men's lives. They found empirically that men, influenced by culture, feel compelled to pursue or emphasize success, power, and competition, often to the detriment of their own well-being. Men who need help or men who fail at something like work, for example, might not just see it as a one-time context-specific failure. They might see it as a failure of being a quote-unquote real man, which is a threat to their identity or what they want their identity to be. We also know that historically, culture encourages men not to express emotion. Quote unquote, real men aren't supposed to be vulnerable or tender. They rub some dirt in it and they move on. And as a result, many traditional men have a really hard time of asking for help or expressing the degree to which they're stressed out about something to begin with. Now, I know many of us aren't shocked about this, but I want you to think about this. Think about the unique pressure this puts on your traditional older farming man. They're told that they must be successful, that they cannot fail, that their family's survival depends on it, that maybe even their very manhood depends on it. And they're told that if they do fail, they can't talk about it. They've just got to grit and bear it and restrict all of their emotion. That's a no-win situation. That's a way to feel trapped and hopeless real quick. And that kind of hopelessness can prompt some pretty drastic behaviors. Is encourager. A minimal encourager will make you look and sound and feel probably like the stereotypical TV show therapist. Well, maybe not every TV show therapist. This is probably more like Fraser Crane than Dr. Phil, but you'll see what I mean. So what are minimal encouragers? Minimal encouragers are verbal or nonverbal statements or gestures that encourage the person you're speaking with to keep talking. They invite more disclosure. They prompt people to go deeper. A helping conversation is kind of like a spinning merry-go-round. Once it's going, it only needs a little push every now and then to keep the spin alive. And that's the essence of the minimal encourager. A minimal encourager is that push to keep the conversation going. So an example of a minimal encourager, what would that be? Well, it might be something as simple as a head nod. Someone's speaking to you, you look them in the eyes, and as they're talking, you nod your head. It shows that you're with them, that you're listening, that you're tuned into what they're saying. It could be something as simple as saying, uh-huh, or yeah, or tell me more about that. Again, really, really short things. They let the person you're speaking with know you're engaged, that you're listening, that you're processing what they're saying, that you're with them. They make people feel seen and heard. And those kinds of qualities then enable deeper disclosure. Again, very simple, but powerful when used appropriately. The next skill is silence. This might not sound like much of a skill, but it's actually pretty hard to implement. It's also potent. One of my former professors used to say, silence is where the work actually happens. But many of us are really uncomfortable with silence, and so we jump in and short circuit the work from happening. We don't allow people the time to think or process. So how and why do we use silence? Well, silence gives our speakers adequate time to talk. We don't want to talk over them or assume that we know what they're going to say. Have you ever been in a conversation with someone who just jumps in over your words and they think they know what you're going to say, but they actually don't? And that actually makes people shut down a little bit more. Silence enables people to prevent that from happening. So when someone finishes a statement and it feels like they might have more to say, or even if you're not sure if they have more to say, just pause. This gives them time to elaborate or continue in another direction. Silence also affords you the opportunity to set or reset the tone and pace of the conversation. If a speaker is frantic or anxious, for example, Don't match their anxiety. Instead, you can use silence to slow yourself down and slow them down. And in doing so, you reset the pace of that conversation. If you use silence appropriately, it really will help calm the speaker and give them the space that they need to give you the information that you need so that you can deliver the best possible help. Next up, we have normalizing statements. Normalizing statements are those that communicate that a speaker is not alone in a given struggle or experience. In some ways, it helps take away the stigma. Potentially, it can even make a problem seem more manageable. People might think if others have made it through something similar, then so can I. And really, in my experience in counseling roles, that's one of the most basic questions all people ask at some point. They ask, can I just make it to the end of this thing? Can I just make it through? Can I make it to the end of this relationship drama or this financial hardship or this, you name it? Can I just make it through this? Normalizing statements can produce a kind of hope that yes, they can make it through. It can let them know that they aren't alone and that people can and have overcome similar things. So what's an example of this? Well, it might be you talking with a producer who's talking about how the pandemic has so deeply affected their industry and what they're doing. You could say, yeah, many farm families I know have been affected by the pandemic. What you're saying to me doesn't sound strange at all. Or you're right. This really does seem like a hard time. I know others who've overcome this, and I think together we can too. Again, these normalizing statements, they let people know that they're not alone given a struggle or experience, takes away the stigma, produces a kind of hope. The last of the most basic helping skills we're talking about today are open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are those that can't be answered with one or two words. They prompt greater disclosure, which gives you, again, more information about the speaker and their needs. It also helps the person you're talking to make sense of their experience because it allows them to put language to it. Talking and naming, prompting speakers to turn their inner world out can be a very powerful experience. Freud called therapy the talking cure. And while Freud was crazy about lots of stuff, I don't think he was wrong about that. And maybe you've even experienced this. Sometimes it's just nice to vent. Sometimes it's just nice to have someone who can ask you the right questions to get at the right things inside of you so that you can release what's inside. So what are some open-ended questions? Well, some examples might be, what resources have you used thus far? Or what kinds of help are you looking for right now? Or how was your experience trying this solution in the past? Or how would you describe the problems you're experiencing right now? And I want you to notice each of those questions that I asked did not start with the word why. Questions that begin with the word why usually can sound accusatory and put people on the defensive. So instead of saying, well, why haven't you used this resource? You could say, again, what resources have you used? Or what was your experience using that resource? Or tell me about your thought process for doing this and not that. Those kinds of things sound less accusatory. Also, another thing, it's very stereotypical that you hear in popular media, therapists asking, how does that make you feel? Most good therapists won't ask you, how does that make you feel? Because it's so commonplace, it sounds cliche. You hear that and all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, what this crap again? Instead, we will ask questions that get at that information, but just without those words. So sometimes if I want to know how someone feels, I'll say, tell me what's going through your mind right now. Or sometimes when people get teary a little bit, if you're talking with them, I say, what emotions are coming up right now? Again, it gets at the same material, but it's not the cliche phrase. And so it helps not to put people on the defensive. Okay, we're now transitioning to some higher order helping skills. I say these are higher order because they aren't necessarily as intuitive as those we just reviewed. And frankly, they can be kind of uncomfortable. Nevertheless, these skills are powerful, and when used appropriately, they can go such a long way to building rapport. The first skill is called immediacy. Immediacy is using your gut to question or draw attention to something in the here and now. It's listening not just to what is being said, it's also listening to how it's being said. It's drawing attention to the dynamic between the two people in the room that moment. So an example of that might be, I noticed when I said fill in the blank, you seemed really hesitant. Tell me more about that. Or, hey, as you talk, I really get this sense that you're worried about finances. Say more about that. So what makes this skill feel weird at times is because it can feel like bad manners. Somehow most of us are taught to ignore those weird, sometimes emotional feelings that we pick up on in the here and now and just move on like they didn't happen. We just kind of ignore that stuff. Immediacy is the exact opposite. It is taking the risk to address what's happening in the here and now. And that's what makes it a risk, because sometimes you might feel something and comment on it and be wrong. And that's why I always preface my immediacy statements with something like, I could be wrong about this, and please tell me if I am, but I just get the sense that X, Y, and Z. So what this does is it empowers those that you're speaking with to correct you if your feeling is off. And if you swing the bat, you might hit something. If you don't swing, you'll never hit a thing. So I encourage you, take that risk. Again, you're the greatest instrument, that most basic idea we talked about at the beginning. If you feel something, very well, maybe that's going on in the moment. The next skill is reflecting feeling, and this can also be challenging. The goal of reflecting feeling seems similar to immediacy. There's some subtle differences in its purposes, which aren't all that necessary to get into here. What's most important is to know this. To reflect feeling is to act like a mirror. It's acknowledging the underlying feelings behind the content of what whoever it is you're speaking to might be saying. So sometimes when we're talking, we're not really aware of what we feel. This happens with a lot of men that I've worked with over the years. They'll say something and there's emotional context underneath it, but sometimes that emotional context doesn't register, even though they're the ones saying it. So sometimes when we're talking, we're not really aware of what we feel. We're just talking. So if someone on the outside watching sees a feeling behind what we're saying and acknowledges it, it can produce greater awareness. And actually, then this is big, actually strengthen the trust between two people. It can build rapport. It can help the speaker feel understood, even when maybe they don't quite understand themselves. So what are some examples of this? Well, it might be saying something like, when you said you had to depopulate your farm, I could really sense the sadness in that. Wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. Or when you were talking about your financial struggles, I could tell that you were getting a little bit angry about all you've had to deal with. Just naming those emotions underneath what they're saying can make people feel seen in a way that they have. And it's like, oh, you really understand me. You get where I'm coming from. Really powerful. I also had a professor at one point that called this kind of listening with your third ear. If you don't feel comfortable reflecting feelings back to someone, maybe don't say them out loud. That's totally cool. Maybe all that you need to do is simply recognize those feelings to yourself and then use that to build empathy for the person you're talking to. I do think this is an interesting note to put on to this. For some people, especially men, all feelings are expressed as either anger or irritation, right? If you have a gruff person in front of you, there might be an underlying emotion aside from anger that they just don't know or don't want to communicate. I've talked to a lot of people over the years who come across really prickly. And it's not that they are prickly, it's just that's the only emotion they've been told is okay to express, or the only emotion they know how to express. And so if you talk to someone who feels a little prickly, it might not be that they're ticked at you. It might just be that's That's just how they've learned to operate in the world. And that's fine. We work with that. The next two skills are tough because used incorrectly, they can make you sound like a jerk. So don't let that deter you, because you'll know what I mean exactly when I explain this, and it'll be pretty obvious how to use them effectively. First, if you can, I think it's good to experiment with appropriate self-disclosure. That means using your own personal experiences to relate to the person you're speaking with, which builds rapport. I would use this sparingly, and this is where it can go off the rails. The helping conversation you're having is not about you. I'm going to say that again. The helping conversation you're having is not about you. Have you ever gone to someone and you started talking to them about something you're going through, and then all of a sudden they turn it into about them, and they're like, oh my God, you have it bad, but let me tell you about what happened to me, or whatever. That is not helpful at all. It turns people off in a major way. So if you can't take your experiences and then use them to pivot back to the person you're speaking with, I wouldn't do it. But if you can, it can be really powerful. So an example of this, you might be talking with a producer who's talking about serious financial hardship, like, can we keep this operation going? And maybe you've been in a similar spot where you and your family have had to really think, can we keep this thing going? You might say something like, my family went through something similar. It can be so hard to cope with. I wonder, tell me how you've been coping with it. Okay, so see what happened there? You took something that you experienced and used it to then pivot back to them. And in doing so, build a little bit of rapport. Another thing, and this isn't universally true, but I'd recommend not self-disclosing if you still have a lot of emotional energy tied up in whatever it is that's being discussed. Classic example is, if you're in the midst of a messy divorce and the person you're trying to help is in the midst of a messy divorce and they're talking about it, might not be a safe thing for you to disclose that, both for yourself and for them. It just might be too emotionally charged still. So if it's a sensitive spot for you, you may just want to avoid that. The last skill that we'll talk about today is called positive reframing. The idea here is that you're looking for strength in the midst of despair. I'll say that again. The idea of positive reframing is that you're looking for strength in the midst of despair. This is not, however, looking at the bright side of life or telling your speaker, well, this might suck, but look at all the good stuff you got going on. People don't want to hear that. When people need help, they don't want to be told to count their blessings, even if they have a lot of blessings. Pain, need, hardship, they blind us to all of that stuff. And we as people on the front lines don't want to minimize anyone's experience or anyone's pain. So how can you do this in a way that affirms their strength but doesn't diminish their pain? Often it means commenting on their strength and their ability to endure. So sometimes if I'm working with someone and they're really going through something, the fact that they've even opened up to me is a sign that they have some courage. And so, and they have some strength. So if someone a producer chooses to disclose something difficult or challenging to you, maybe the positive reframe is, God, it sounds so hard in your life right now, but I admire the strength you have to reach out. You might be struggling, but the courage you have, the courage you're demonstrating tells me you're an overcomer and that you're going to get through this perhaps, right? So what that does is, again, looks for strength in the midst of despair. So I want to return to what we started with just briefly, and that's a look at your traditional, rugged, self-reliant man, who we know in Illinois is most likely to be the kind of producer that you're working with. As we said before, often men are resistant to help seeking and they're resistant to emotionality. So I want to ask the question that probably a lot of you are thinking right now, and that's, well, if that's true, if men are resistant to help seeking, if they are resistant to emotionality, then how are any of those skills you just talked about, how is that not a giant waste of time? And I think that's a really fair question. I have a few answers to that. And the first is that the skills do work. I don't know how else to explain it other than to say, I've lived it, I've seen it. It may take some relationship building to use those skills over time, but they do work. The second answer is this: there is a way to adapt our helping approach when working with men. And much of this is based on that idea of positive reframing we just discussed. It's looking for strength in the midst of the mess. Or it might be positive reframing where we give people a new metaphor to think with about help seeking. I'll explain more about that here in a second. Men who don't ask for help and who don't demonstrate emotion, we know the scholarship is clear on this, they're unhealthier than those who do. But there are qualities that traditional men possess that can be leveraged into strengths because they are strengths. Like I said at the beginning, some of these qualities that these rugged, self-reliant traditional men, those are the qualities that have caused them to persist through time. But there are ways to approach men that make this all feel like a little bit less of a threat, perhaps. Traditional men might be more willing to receive help if you approach them as a partner rather than as a savior. In fact, that's probably just good practice with everyone. I was reviewing some of the men's studies research in anticipation of this webinar, and one group of writers acknowledged that men are typically comfortable with and socialized to work as part of teams. They play sports, they're in fraternities, they're in the military. Maybe frame help giving as being part of their team. You're not there to take their power away. You're not there to save them. You're not there because they're deficient. You're just there to assist and to be a resource for them. Maybe you are one of the tools that they use on their farm. Some men are especially affected by army men or the good guys who save the day, and needing help may make them feel like they failed in that regard. You might want to communicate with your actions and your words that reaching out for help actually makes them the hero of their family. They had the courage to take the risk, to call a stranger, or to talk to someone they know and disclose something that may feel embarrassing. And in doing so, they are saving the day for their family. They're the hero they've rescued. And if it's ethical and you know other men or producers in general who are respected in the community, who've also reached out for help, and maybe they've overcome something, perhaps get permission to connect to those people. Seeing other men as successful and heroic for asking for help will help normalize help seeking as a heroic act. Also, there aren't many positive or structured rites of passage in our society today, but that doesn't mean that we can't create any. So if you're working with a producer who maybe has children, you might frame help seeking as a way to pass along their expertise down the generations and maybe make that a tradition. When we run into this problem, what do? This is the resource we access. These are the people we talk to, and this is how we talk to them. We share honestly with them so that we can get the help that we need to save the operation. Help seeking can then become a way to pass down or train the next generation, pass the torch, leave the mark, protect the family legacy. Getting help then becomes an opportunity to share wisdom. It's not a detriment or some deficiency. It's an opportunity to learn. Another kind of positive reframe that came across when talking to some people was, maybe it's best not to talk in emotionally charged language with men or with any producer. Maybe it's just kind of matter of fact. Maybe we think about farmers and producers in general as machines. Farmers and producers spend a lot of time maintaining the equipment on their farms. They do that to prevent damage. They do that to prevent cost. And the most valuable asset that farmers have on their balance sheet is themselves, right? That's the most valuable tool they have is them. And so maybe we reframe help seeking not as, oh, you're going to go get help. Maybe we reframe it as maintenance on your most valuable implement, your most valuable instrument, your most valuable tool. For some people, that's been helpful. So this is a little bit of a review on some of the stuff we just talked about. Super simple. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to review some of those basic helping skills. So which helping skill involves naming or recognizing the feelings underlying a person's remarks? Think about that. What do we talk about? It's like holding a mirror up to people, acknowledging the emotional subtext, perhaps, of what they're saying. That's reflection of feeling. Also, sometimes you may not reflect the feeling by saying it out loud. You may just use that inside to build empathy for someone you're speaking with. What helping skill involves the use of short words or phrases like, yeah, tell me more about that, in hopes that it stimulates the person to say more. Think about that. What do we say? It's kind of like a merry-go-round. We just need a little push every now and then to keep the thing going. It's a minimal encourager. Again, those really short statements or nonverbal actions that let people know you're with them, you're tuned in, you hear them, and it helps them keep talking. 45-year-old man, let's say maybe they call you up. They're a producer. They have concerns about the viability of their farm due to some economic hardship. They say, I've tried everything I know what to do. Nothing seems to be working. How do you use the skill of positive reframing there? Well, positive reframing, again, looking for strength in the midst of despair. Maybe it's that you comment and you say something like, I really admire the strength that you have to reach out about this. That kind of courage demonstrates for me you have this, what it takes to find an answer to this solution. Let's work together to do that. This webinar, which is part 2, focuses primarily on how to recognize the signs that someone might be in some kind of psychological distress. As with the first part of this, it's very light touch on topics that run really, really deep. You're not going to finish today and be a therapist. You will finish today, hopefully, with an appreciation for the range of ways that people might react to the difficult things that are happening in their lives. Our lives are complicated and messy. And given the nature of your work, you might be among the first people to notice that something isn't quite right with a producer or their family. And that's an amazing, sobering honor. As with the previous webinar, to smooth out any potential technology glitches, go ahead and make sure your microphones are muted. And then if you do have something you'd like to contribute, don't hesitate to jump in, take yourself off mute, or put something in the chat. This webinar will run about the same time as the last one, 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how many questions, how much discussion. My goal for this webinar are really the same goals as the first webinar. First, I want to pull back the curtain. Just like with helping skills, there's a lot of mystery about mental health and mental illness and reactions that people can have to stress. As best as I can, I want to take the mystery out of that. The conditions that we're going to discuss today aren't bizarre. In some respects, they're actually quite normal. In fact, to be human is to experience all of these things: sadness, anxiety, hopelessness to some degree. And statistically speaking, a big chunk of the people that you know in your day-to-day life are probably on some kind of medication to treat one or more of these conditions. Antidepressant, anti-anxiety medication is very commonly prescribed. Distress is a common thing, and getting help for it is actually becoming more common, more normal than not. I want to issue a disclaimer, though, and that's this. Though I'm going to be talking through some diagnostic criteria for things like depression and anxiety, I don't think it's our job to go around diagnosing people. Good diagnosis is a complex, multifaceted, time-consuming process. It's not important that we have a label for people, I don't think. It is important that we notice when things are off, and then we intervene in some way. Second, I'd like to emphasize application in this conversation. How do we determine if you're witnessing psychological distress? And if you are witnessing psychological distress, how do you intervene in that situation? I hope after today, you come away with, again, a few more tools in your toolbox. I hope things maybe feel even less scary and less intimidating and more understandable today. And I hope you feel more comfortable to engage people who are hurting. In short, and I know this might sound really hokey, but I hope you feel more empowered to make a difference where you're at. You're in positions where you could alter the course of someone's life for the long haul. And that's a big deal. But back in 2020, researchers published a pilot study looking at depression, anxiety, and stress in 170 what they term young farmers and ranchers in the Midwest. And when they say young, the average age of their participants was about 30 years old, okay? They found that 71% of those people met criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, and 53% met criteria for major depressive disorder. Now, let me say that again, because that's wild. 71% of 170 young farmers and ranchers in the Midwest, criteria for generalized anxiety, over half major depressive disorder. Those are serious numbers. Our producers are feeling the squeeze. Sometimes the stressors get to be too much for our producers. This is a photo of a story that ran in USA Today back in 2020 about the uptick in producer suicides. It's a really sobering headline. And I think it's worth beginning with a snapshot of what life is like for our producers and their family members. You all know this. You could be doing a webinar for the rest of the world about the things that are stressing people out, our producers out. Stress and anxiety comes from poor weather conditions. It comes in fluctuations in the price of goods. Heard recently fertilizer is like crazy expensive right now and really hurting people. Supply chain problems, global trade negotiations, succession planning, the grueling taxing labor that's required of farm work, pandemics. There are a lot of major stressors. And though the ag community is big, the work can feel isolating at times. And this puts our producers and their family members in impossible situations. It takes a toll on their mental health. And sometimes they see no other solution than to die. That's a really bold statement. That's a really sad statement. Sometimes they see no other escape. And it ought not be that way. I think this is important context. And I think it's important for a reason, because it's normal to face these kinds of stressors and feel depressed, anxious, and hopeless because of them. Let me say that again. It is absolutely normal to face these kinds of stressors and feel depressed, anxious, and hopeless because of them. If someone didn't feel sad, anxious, and hopeless in response to some of these things, I'd want to check their pulse to make sure they were alive. So what's my point in saying that? Well, our depressed, anxious, hopeless producers and their family members are not bizarre. They're not aberrations. They are not unusual. They're not weak. They're not defective. They're not people who just can't cut it. No, they're just flesh and blood. And of course they're depressed. Of course they're anxious. Of course they're hopeless. Who wouldn't be? And with the right tools, perhaps, maybe, they don't have to be those things anymore. I see H. Anderson dropped this in the chat, said increased use of alcohol, which is a depressant. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's always funny to me when you watch movies and stuff and people go through a breakup or whatever, and then they're at the bar drinking. It's like, that's actually going to make you sadder, most likely. It's going to depress your central nervous system. Let's talk about the signs someone might show if they're experiencing depression. Before we dig in, though, I have two notes about my approach for this portion of our talk. First, I'm going to show you a lot of information quickly. Unlike the first part of this webinar series, I'm going to display each slide in this section in its entirety. And I'm doing that because each of these indicators overlap quite a bit. And if you want to take notes, you can. That's absolutely not obligated, of course. But if you do want to write some notes down, I want to show it to you all at once. And second, I want to let you know that these are just indicators. Though many of them are taken from formal diagnostic criteria for major depressive episodes and so on, they're not meant to be used for true diagnosis. Rather, they're meant to give us a taste a flavor of how depression might look. So people experiencing depression might present in any number of ways, really. They might have a consistent, persistent sadness. They might lose pleasure in things they once enjoyed. They might have fluctuations in their weight without trying, either gaining a lot, losing a lot. They might not have much of an appetite, or they might have too much of an appetite. They might have trouble sleeping or feel like they can't get enough sleep. They might feel lethargic, no energy, easily exhausted, even from routine stuff they've done their whole life. They may feel guilty. They might not be able to focus like they once did. Or maybe they might be paralyzed trying to make decisions. They might be thinking about death as a way to find relief. I'm going to argue that all people have experienced one or more of these things at some point in their lives. It's important to remember, though, that just because you're sad doesn't mean you're depressed. That makes you human. To be sad is to be human, or to be human is to be sad from time to time. Instead, these symptoms, building on one another, persisting over a period of time, start to raise a question that there might be a problem. Things start to get out of hand when these symptoms accumulate and persist over time, and when they themselves become a cause of distress. And this is a big one, when they interfere with daily functioning. That's big. If these kinds of things start to interfere with a person's ability to function on a day-to-day basis, and it's a significant deviation from the norm, all of that stuff seems to build evidence that there's some kind of underlying problem. So what might be clues to alert you to possible depression? Well, it could be a producer who used to enjoy woodworking in the shop or grabbing coffee at the McDonald's with friends in the morning, but now hasn't worked in the shop for a month and says he doesn't want to meet friends in the coffee shop anymore. Again, that's kind of a change from the norm, maybe a little isolation, withdrawing, loss of interest or pleasure in things you once enjoyed. It could be someone who's been sad, who's had trouble sleeping. Maybe they don't feel much energy anymore. And so they go to their primary care doctor and they think something's wrong with them physically. And when the primary care doctor comes back and says, no, everything checks out, it doesn't look like there's anything going on, then you might think, well, why am I having all these physiological symptoms of appetite, sleep, whatever? It might be a sign there's some kind of emotional something happening, maybe a touch of depression. It could be a spouse who says they've noticed a change, that their husband or wife isn't the same person anymore. It could be any number of things. My recommendation, again, is this. Back the first thing we talked about in the last part of this, you are the greatest instrument. I think you should trust your gut. If something feels off to you, then it might actually be off. We'll talk more in a second about what to do if your gut tells you that something might be off or that someone might be in danger, maybe of hurting themselves. So stay tuned for that. For all the reasons I discussed in part one of this webinar series, I think it's important to talk about how depression might manifest in men. Again, that's the largest number of producers in Illinois. Most of you on this call are Illinois-based. Sometimes the signs are different, and there's a reason. Men in most Western cultures, like we talked about, aren't socialized to talk about or express their emotions. We've all heard the phrase, boys don't cry, and things like that. In fact, the only emotion that society really tells men is okay to express is anger. It's okay to see an angry man. It's not okay to see a man who cries. So this can result in a couple of things. Sometimes this lack of emotional literacy means men might not know what they feel. In fact, it's funny, I have men who are relatives, and clearly, sometimes really horrible things happen, health problems. They find out they've got cancer, what have you. And you're just going to check in with you and say, I'm so sorry that, this is happening. And it doesn't register to them. They don't know what they feel. Or sometimes all the feelings come out as irritability or anger. It's like, someone who has a health problem and you say, hey, I'm really sorry to hear that. And they're like, wow, blah, blah, blah. It's probably some sadness that's leaking out as anger, perhaps. So if you have a male farmer who seems angry, aggressive, irritable, it might not be exactly what it seems. It could be a sign of something more happening just below the surface, maybe even sadness. We're going to pivot now to anxiety. Anxiety can exist separate from depression or right alongside it. And there are many, many ways in which anxiety can manifest. You can have panic attacks. You can have some kind of social phobia, social anxiety. I don't think it's necessary that we discuss each one of those things. Instead, I'm going to talk about just some kind of common traits that are unique to anxiety, perhaps. And we're going to talk about two of those basic indicators. So the best known synonym for anxiety is worry or nervousness. Now, all people feel worry from time to time. That's totally normal. But there are times when worry takes over, when it impairs our ability to function. When worry becomes excessive, you should take note. And you might be wondering, well, how do I know if my worry is excessive? Or how do I know if someone else's worry is excessive? Well, often excessive worry becomes rumination. Rumination is a 10-cent word that basically means you keep replaying a fear or a concern over and over and over again in your mind. It's like getting stuck in a worry trap that you just can't get out of. It's all you think about, it's all you talk about, it's all that you Google search. Your behavior changes to accommodate the worry. You might even seek constant reassurance from others that a specific thing you're worried about is going to work out. Rumination is a vicious, persistent, nasty thing. It steals people's joy and often leaves them feeling hopeless. Rumination isn't hard to spot typically because people who ruminate have trouble hiding it unless they completely isolate themselves altogether, which happens. And that in and of itself is another indicator that something might be wrong. People might also experience physical manifestations of their anxiety. We're probably all fairly familiar with something called panic disorder or panic attacks, which is when a person's anxiety looks and feels similar to a medical condition. They have trouble breathing, they get a heavy feeling on their chest, they start sweating, they get the shakes, their voice starts to quiver. If people experience these symptoms, they should be encouraged to consult a physician just to rule out any underlying physical conditions. Absolutely important. If someone is having those kinds of physical symptoms, talk to a doctor, a physician, make sure there's not something else going on. But if there is no physiological explanation, it's probably anxiety. So what do you do if someone presents with excessive worry? Well, I think you use the helping skills we discussed in the first part of this. Ask open-ended questions, get people talking, help normalize your experience. Reflect feeling to show that you're with them in the moment, affirm their courage and tenacity through a positive reframe, and perhaps encourage them again to see their physician, especially if they told you they're having new physical symptoms. People who suffer with anxiety, and that's exactly what it is, it's suffering, are like giant balloons filled with so much air they're about to burst. And helping skills are kind of like a small little pinprick that momentarily releases some of that pressure without just all together destroying that balloon. Okay, we've talked about some heavy stuff so far, and we're about to get into even more stuff that can feel kind of heavy for people. So before jumping in, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that these can be really difficult topics. These aren't just academic ideas without emotion tied to them. Each of these things, depression, anxiety, suicide, they're real. They affect real, living, breathing people. And I'm sure if I open the floor now to talk about this, each of us could speak about the influence these things have exerted on our lives or on the lives of the people we love. So I want to encourage you, take heart. These are hard things to talk about, but by doing so, you might just become the instrument for someone's healing. So I'm going to display several signs indicating someone might be considering suicide. This is in no way an exhaustive list. And just because someone might exhibit one or more of these signs, it doesn't mean they're suicidal at all. It does, however, mean that we should take note and be prepared to, at the very least, check in on them and ask them how they're doing and refer them for more help. So here we go. It's a myth that people who talk about suicide aren't likely to commit suicide. Talking about suicide is a serious thing that should be taken seriously, even if it's couched in a joke. So if someone talks about suicide, and we're going to get a little bit more explicit instruction about this in a moment, follow up with that person. Ask them if they're serious about it. That can feel really bold, but it's important. And again, more about that in a minute. Isolation or withdrawing from others, that's another warning sign. Being around others is often hard when you're hurting, and isolation rarely makes anything better. It often just exacerbates the problem. And it can indicate that a person is trying to cut ties with the world around them. People considering suicide often feel trapped or hopeless. They might feel like death is their only chance to experience relief. They might start to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, something H. Anderson in the chat talked about, very appropriately so. They might start to give their stuff away and say goodbye to people. That's kind of a telltale symptom of, or indicator, I should say. This one seems kind of counterintuitive, but people with a history of depression or anxiety with a sudden positive change in their mood might be considering suicide. And the change in mood might be because come from the perceived relief that they're going to feel from not being alive anymore. It's like, oh crap, I finally figured out how I'm going to escape this. I'm finally going to get some relief, and their mood kind of perks up. People see that and they think, oh, maybe they've had a breakthrough. It can actually mean just the opposite. And certainly if someone experiencing these kinds of difficulties starts accumulating the means that could kill them, you might check in, especially if you know they have a history of depression or anxiety. So I want to talk about what do we do if we suspect that someone is considering suicide, because this is really, really, really big stuff. And I'm going to preface all this by saying what I'm going to walk you through now, basic triage for suicidal ideation, it's going to feel and sound really bold, but this is what we do. So first, if we suspect someone is considering suicide, we ask them as straightforward as we can, are you considering suicide? If they answer yes, it's an indication to take it very, very seriously, and we proceed through the next questions. Even if they say no, just to cover all the bases, I would probably ask the questions. I do ask the questions, but if they say yes, take it very seriously. So first, you ask someone, are you thinking about suicide? If they say yes, and probably even if they say no, but if they say yes, I would ask them then, do you have a plan for how you're going to kill yourself? Like, be that blunt, be that straightforward. If they answer no, it might indicate that they're not in any immediate danger, but that they should still be seeking deeper help. And if the answer is yes, you should absolutely proceed to the next question. And again, I would, even if it's no, but I would proceed to the next question. And that's asking, well, do you have the means to carry out your suicide plan? You've told me that, yes, you're thinking about it. You've told me that, yes, you do have a plan. Well, do you have the means to carry out that plan? If the answer is no, again, it's an indication that perhaps no immediate danger. I don't know, perhaps. I still think even if the answer is no, especially if the answer is yes, proceed to the next question. Because each successive yes is an indication that the threat is more and more severe. So if they say, yes, I'm thinking about it. If they say, yes, I have a plan. Yes, I have the means. Definitely ask, when do you plan to kill yourself? Ask about the timeline. If they say, no, I don't have a timeline, it's still serious. And you should probably stay with them and talk to them and refer them on for greater help. Again, use your intellect, use your gut in combination. Those two things should help you gauge what's in front of you. But if they say yes, it's very, very serious. It means they have intent, they have a plan, they have the means to carry out that plan, and they have a timeline by which to die by suicide, and they're very high risk. If you're with them physically, you shouldn't let them out of your sight. If you're on the phone with them and you're running through this, you shouldn't get off the phone with them. Very, very serious. Again, very bold. I know this is very, very bold, but you ask as straightforward as possible. And some of you might be thinking right now, holy crap, I can't do this. This is way beyond what I signed up for. Yeah, it's scary. Maybe a good thing is to find someone that you trust and practice just saying the words with them, simulate a little bit. That way it gets maybe more routine, more familiar, the boldness kind of gets stripped out of it a little bit. I can tell you, I've used this kind of suicide triage for years, and I don't even blink. It doesn't even cross my mind to think twice about it. If I feel like someone might be thinking about that, I ask. And it's just like drinking water, birds fly in the air, fish swim in the sea. Nick is asking people if they're going to kill themselves. I mean, honestly, it's that straightforward. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, so if I can do this, I can ask these questions. If I role play or something like that, I can get myself to ask these questions if I'm in a situation. But you might be thinking, okay, so what if I ask the questions and they say yes to everything? What the heck do I do about that? What do I do if someone is actively suicidal right in front of me? Well, there are several things you can do. First, I think you need to be honest about your intentions. Tell them you're worried about them. Tell them that you plan to call others to get help. Don't give them a false sense of confidentiality when it comes to suicidal ideation. You don't need to get their permission to involve other people. I do think, however, that it's good to get their permission to involve others. Now, you might be thinking, isn't that contradictory? Well, let me tell you what I mean by that. Sometimes I ask people who are, if I'm doing kind of suicide triage, they answer yes to all the questions. I'm really concerned about them. I say, I'm going to call so-and-so, and I might say, do I have your permission to call them and maybe put them on speakerphone while we talk? And what that does is it's very low threshold of buy-in. It gets them to verbalize and give you permission, yes, and it's a form of buy-in. Now, if they say no, you can say, well, too dang bad, I'm calling them anyhow. And they can get up and hang up on the phone with you, walk out of your office, what have you. That's fine, but you're obligated. It's ethically, I believe, morally, I believe, to let someone know about this who can follow up. So again, it's this low-level permission granting as a form of buy-in. You might say, let's call the suicide hotline. Is it okay if I dial and you do all the talking? 9 times out of 10, people say yes. Very few times people say no. And even if they do, you keep on going. No confidentiality in that situation. Always refer to, well, I want to put a little caveat on that. If you work for an organization where you've got clients or something like that, you may want to actually talk with your supervisor or your legal team. On my end, I'm speaking in terms of we're saving people's lives things, but maybe you have a relationship with a client or something. You probably ought to ask your legal team, if this happens, do I have permission to do this? The answer should be yes, I would think. But you may want to just do your due diligence. For me, I think it's a moral obligation to do that. Number 2, always refer or engage people who can provide more help than you can. Have the numbers of the local mental health agencies handy. Have a local physician, maybe if there aren't mental health agencies or mental health providers in the area. Maybe there's a primary care physician or a hospital or something like that. Get their numbers handy, develop relationships with them. Say, hey, if I come across this, can I refer them to you? Most regions in the state of Illinois are covered by a mental health agency that has a crisis response unit. You can get them to come out or have a phone call with them. Really, really important. And then in a second, I'm going to talk about how to involve local law enforcement. Number 3, I would call a suicide hotline. This number offers help for people who are both thinking about suicide and for people who are helping someone who is actively suicidal. This is the number here, 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-TALK, 8255. Really great resource. I'd have that handy. In fact, you may even, well, I'm going to put a pause on that to come back to that in a minute. And then also, if the person isn't physically present with you and you're worried about them, or they storm out of your office, or they hang up with you on the phone while you're talking about this, I think it's appropriate and wise to contact your local law enforcement. If it's an immediate active threat, you can call 911 or have someone else call 911 while you remain on the phone. But local law enforcement can do what's called a well check. So depending on the situation, you can call the non-emergency line, have officers do this well check. And what they'll do is they'll go to the person's home, knock on the door, and say, hey, we just want to make sure you're doing okay. I think it's really important to be honest with the people that you're speaking to. Again, because if you plan to call law enforcement, tell the person you're speaking with that you do plan to call law enforcement, because having the police show up can unexpectedly escalate the situation. I was in a situation, I can tell you 2 examples. I was in a situation several years ago. Someone was actively suicidal. They were getting ready to walk out the door to their car to leave. And I told them as they were walking out, I said, if you walk out, I am going to call the police to have them do a well check. So if you walk out, just know that you might be encountering them. And they were like, oh, okay, well, this is serious. Maybe I don't want to walk out right now. And then I've had situations where I am worried about someone, and I'm not in a position where I can talk to them, or they've disconnected in some way, and I call law enforcement. Law enforcement, super professional. They do this. This is part of what it means to be law enforcement. And so they handle this many times with a lot of grace and expertise. Okay, so some resources. In Illinois, the Illinois Department of Ag actually has a really great mental health resource page. It's got links to podcasts and hotlines and websites, YouTube videos, how to find a counselor. Many of these resources are good regardless of the state you're in. I know we have someone from out of state that's part of this call. Really, really great resource. I highly recommend you check it out. I've got a picture of the page here, and then here's the link, although you can just Google Illinois Department of Agriculture mental health assistance, and it should pop up. Also, there's something called mental health first aid. This is a big, long training on much of what we talked about today. Today was really light touch on a lot of topics. Mental health first aid is like 8 hours of training that's deep touch on all of these topics. And it addresses some other things like psychosis and stuff like that. Generally, people think, I don't have 8 hours to commit to that. But then they go do it and they're like, holy crap, that was really, really good. I'm so glad I did that. School of Medicine, SIU School of Medicine offers mental health first aid trainings. That's part through the Farm Family Resource Initiative. The Center for Rural Health and Social Service Development offers that. If you're interested in that kind of thing, you can certainly contact Karen Stallman, who runs the Farm Family Resource Initiative. I believe she's probably been the person promoting this webinar. She can give you some information about that, or you can go to their website. Also, the Farm Family Resource Initiative, that's an SIU School of Medicine program that's partnered with some others across the state. A lot of people have their hands in this, and it's a really terrific resource. The web page here is constantly evolving. Things are constantly being added to it. There are some recordings on there. There are some links to other resources, updates about different things. In certain counties, we have a helpline that producers and their families can call 24 hours a day to talk about things. Really, really terrific resource. Great thing to stay up to date with, because more and more will get added.